dark and lethal, burning with a terrifying, dying embers glow of defiance. Even the rain didn't just fall in the neon-soaked backstreets of Seoul. It screamed, washing away the sins of the city into the storm drains. Chloe pulled her hoodie tighter, the fabric already heavy and damp against her skin. She was exhausted, her mind still looping through the ethics lecture she'd just left, but a sound, thin, sharp, and desperately fragile, forced her to stop. It wasn't the mewl of a stray cat or the whistle of the wind. It was a human whimper, the kind that only comes from a pair of lungs that haven't yet learned how to speak. She turned into the mouth of a narrow alley, her sneakers splashing into a puddle that looked unervingly dark under the flickering amber street lamp. As she moved deeper, the metallic scent of iron hit her, sharp enough to taste. There, slumped against a rusted dumpster, sat a man who looked like a fallen king. Even in the shadows, his presence was suffocating. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Chloe's entire tuition, but the crisp white shirt beneath it was shredded, soaked in a spreading mask of deep crimson. Chloe's breath hitched, her hand flying to her cheek. "Oh my God," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. Her first instinct was to run to find a phone, to vanish before the violence that did this returned. But then she saw them. Tucked into the man's massive, trembling arms were two small bundles of white fleece. They were newborns, their tiny faces serene and untouched by the carnage surrounding them. The man's head lolled back against the brick, his sharp features pale as ash, but as Chloe approached, his eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a predator as his life leaked onto the pavement. His grip on the twins tightened, his knuckles white. He looked at Chloe not with a plea for mercy, but with a warning. He was a wounded beast, ready to tear out the throat of anyone who dared touch his cubs. "Don't move," his voice grated out, a low, wet rasp that sent a shiver down Chloe's spine. Chloe froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the glint of a heavy black pistol resting just inches from his hand, and for a second, the world narrowed down to the edge of a blade. But as she looked from the cold steel of the gun to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the babies, the fear in her chest turned into a fierce, irrational protective heat. She wasn't a doctor, and she certainly wasn't a hero, but she saw the way his arms were beginning to shake. If he collapsed, the twins would hit the freezing concrete. "I'm not going to hurt them," Chloe said, her voice trembling but certain. She dropped her backpack, kneeling in the blood-stained water. "And I'm not going to let you die either." For a heartbeat, the tiger of soul searched her face, looking for a hidden knife or a treacherous smile. Finding only the terrifying innocence of a girl who had no idea whose life she was about to save, the tension in his shoulders finally snapped. His head fell forward, and the most feared man in the city surrendered his weight to a stranger. The adrenaline surged through Chloe's veins, a sharp contrast to the freezing rain that continued to lash against her back. She didn't have a medical kit, and the nearest hospital felt like it was on another planet, so she reached for the only thing she had. With trembling fingers, she unzipped her gray hoodie, pulling it off and leaving her in a thin t-shirt. She folded the thick cotton into a makeshift pressure pad, her eyes darting to the heavy black pistol that lay inches from the man's hand. "I need to press down," she whispered, more to herself than him. "It's going to hurt." As she leaned forward, pressing the hoodie against the jagged wound in his side, Seojun's body bucked. A guttural groan escaped his lips, his head thrashing against the brick wall. His hand shot out, his fingers, thick and scarred, clamping around Chloe's wrist like a steel vice. For a second, he looked ready to snap her bone, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for a threat. But Chloe didn't flinch. She leaned her weight into the wound, her face inches from his, her expression filled with a raw, terrifying compassion. Seojun felt the world slipping into a gray haze, but the girl's touch was an anchor. "Why?" The word echoed in the hollow chambers of his mind. He was a monster, a man whose very name was synonymous with the graveyard. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only moved for money or fear. If one of his lieutenants had found him like this, They would have finished the job to take his throne. If a civilian had found him, they would have screamed and run. Yet, this girl, this child with her college backpack and shaking hands, was staying. She was ruining her clothes, risking her life, and looking at him not as a king or a killer, but as a father. He felt the warmth of the twins against his chest, their rhythmic breathing the only light left in his darkening world. He looked at Chloe's face, wet with rain and tears, and felt a surge of confusion more painful than the bullet hole. She should run. Doesn't she smell the death on me? Stay with me, Chloe pleaded, her voice cracking as she felt the warm blood soak through the layers of her hoodie. Yuna and Yumi need you. Look at them. The mention of his daughter's names she couldn't possibly know unless she'd seen the embroidery on their blankets, sent a jolt through his heart. He forced his hand to relax, his grip on her wrist softening until his palm just rested against her skin. He realized then that he wasn't just gambling with his own life anymore. He was gambling with hers. By staying, she had stepped into the crosshairs of the men who were hunting him. Go, he rasped, the word tasting of copper. They're coming. Chloe shook her head, her jaw setting in a line of stubborn defiance. Then we're all going together. The roar of an engine nearby, low and predatory, cut through the rhythm of the rain. It wasn't the sound of a passing taxi. It was the synchronized hum of black sedans prowling the perimeter. Seojun's eyes sharpened, the haze of blood loss momentarily scorched away by pure survivalist instinct. He tried to shift, but his legs were leaden, the ground slick with a mixture of oil and his own life. Up, Chloe hissed, her voice a wire-thin thread of panic and resolve. She hooked her arms under his, the wet fabric of his expensive suit sliding against her skin. You have to get up. Now. With a jagged, agonizing breath, Seojun heaved himself upward, his weight nearly crushing the girl. He gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles jumping as he fought the urge to black out. He kept his arms locked around the twins, their small, warm bodies the only thing keeping his heart beating. Chloe staggered, her sneakers skidding on the wet asphalt, but she held him. She was half his size, a student whose heaviest burden was usually a pile of textbooks, but in that moment she was a pillar of iron. They had only moved 20 paces when high-beam headlights swept across the brick opening of the alley. The tires of a dark SUV screeched to a halt, the doors swinging open with clinical precision. Men in long coats stepped out, their faces obscured by the shadows of their umbrellas, but the glint of silenced pistols in their hands told Chloe everything she needed to jump. Through there, she whispered, pointing to a narrow service gate half hidden by overgrown ivy. They moved in a frantic, stumbling dance. In the dim light of the fairy lights, the contrast was haunting. The most feared man in the Korean underworld sat bleeding on a thrift store rug, a loaded weapon in his lap, while a college girl in a damp t-shirt sang a soft, senseless lullaby to his daughters. You're good at that, Seojun rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. Chloe didn't look up from Yuna's tiny, drinking face. Someone has to be, she replied softly. They don't care who you are, Seojun. They just care that you're here. The newborns finally drifted back into a fitful sleep, their small breaths the only sound in the suffocating stillness of the room. Chloe set them down in a nest of pillows on her bed, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned back to the man on the rug, knowing she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. The blood had stopped gushing, but the hoodie was a sodden black-red weight that needed to be replaced with proper bandages if he was going to survive the night. I need to clean the wound, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Seojun didn't protest. His strength was a guttering candle, his head lolling back against the sofa. With trembling fingers, Chloe began to peel away the ruined silk of his shirt. As the fabric came away, she gasped, the air catching in her throat. It wasn't just the jagged, angry puncture of the bullet wound that stopped her heart, it was what lay across his skin. Emerging from the collar of his shirt and sprawling across his broad chest was an intricate, terrifying masterpiece of ink. A dragon, fierce and serpentine, coiled around his torso, its scales rendered with a detail that looked almost alive in the dim, flickering fairy lights. Below it, a series of traditional symbols and dark, jagged characters marked him with the unmistakable brand of the Korean underworld's most elite syndicate. Chloe froze, the wet towel in her hand dropping to the floor with a heavy thud. She wasn't just looking at a wounded man. She was looking at a map of a war zone. This wasn't a tattoo born of a drunken night or a youthful mistake. This was the tiger's crest. She realized with a sickening jolt that the man bleeding out on her thrift store rug wasn't just a victim of a random mugging. He was the storm itself. He was the man the news warned about, the one whose name was whispered in fear by the very police who were supposed to protect her. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. Every shadow seemed to move, hiding the ghosts of the men he had killed. Fear, cold and paralyzing, washed over her. She took a step back, her eyes wide, her gaze darting toward the door. If she ran now, if she just vanished into the night, she might still save herself. She could leave the monster and his children to the darkness. Seo-jun's eyes flickered open, catching her movement. He saw the recognition in her face, the way her gaze fixed on the dragon on his chest. A grim, hollow smile touched his bloodless lips. He didn't reach for the gun this time. He simply closed his eyes, his posture sagging with a silent, devastating acceptance. He was waiting for her to bolt. He was waiting for her to realize that a lamb had no business tending to a wolf. Chloe's hand reached for the doorknob, her fingers brushing the cold metal. But then a soft, dreaming whimper came from the bed. She looked at the twins, tiny, nameless, and innocent, and then back at the man who had used his last breath to shield them. The wolf was a monster, yes, but he was a father. And in this small, dusty apartment, she was the only thing standing between those babies and a world that wanted them dead. Her hand dropped from the lock. With a shuddering breath, Chloe picked up the towel, knelt back down in the blood, and began to clean the wound of the most dangerous man she had ever met. The stillness of the apartment was shattered by a harsh, insistent vibration. It wasn't a ringtone, but the low, guttural buzz of a phone against the floorboards, sounding like a rattlesnake in the small room. Seo-jun flinched, his hand moving with agonizing slowness toward his pocket, but his fingers lacked the strength to even grasp the device. It slid across the floor, the screen illuminating the darkroom with a clinical white light. The name on the screen was simply a single character, but the sight of it made Seo-jun's jaw tighten so hard Chloe heard the bone creak. His eyes met hers, urgent and burning. "The speaker," he rasped, his voice barely a thread of sound. Do not. Let him know." Chloe's hands shook as she reached for the phone. This was the moment the door between her world and his vanished completely. She swiped the screen and hit the speaker icon, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Boss!" The voice on the other end was smooth, dripping with a false, oily concern that made Chloe's skin crawl. "We lost the trail in the rain. We're worried, Seo-jun. The brothers are asking questions. If you're hurt, tell us where you are. We'll send the doctors to pick you up." Chloe looked at Seo-jun. He was watching her, his face a mask of pale stone, giving her a single sharp nod. He needed time. He needed the traitors to keep searching the streets while he bled out on her rug. He can't talk right now," Chloe said. The first few words were a breathless mess, but she swallowed hard, forcing her voice to flatten into a lie. She thought of the babies sleeping behind her. She thought of the blood on her hands. "He's in a meeting. A private one." There was a long, chilling silence on the other end of the line. Chloe held her breath, certain the man could hear her heart thudding through the microphone. "A meeting?" the voice asked, the edge of a suspicion sharpening the tone. "Who is this? Where is his usual detail?" "He sent them away," Chloe replied, her voice gaining a strange, desperate steadiness. She leaned into the role of a girl who knew secrets she shouldn't. "He said if anyone interrupted him tonight, they wouldn't live to see the sunrise. Do you want to be the one to test him?" Another pause. Seojun's eyes widened slightly, a flash of grim approval crossing his features. "Tell him we'll wait for his signal," the voice finally replied, though the threat remained. "But tell him the clock is ticking. The city is getting restless." The line went dead. Chloe let the phone slip from her fingers, her strength finally failing her as she sank back onto her heels. She had just lied to a murderer. She had just bought them an hour, maybe two, before the tiger's absence became a death sentence. Seojun reached out, his hand brushing against hers. For the first time, there was no predator in his gaze, only a profound, shadowed recognition. "You have a talent for deception," he whispered. "I'm not lying," Chloe said, looking at the sleeping twins. "I'm protecting them." The reprieve was a lie, a thin veil of safety that tore the moment the heavy thud of combat boots echoed in the hallway. It wasn't the rhythmic walk of a neighbor returning late. It was the synchronized, deliberate movement of men who hunted for a living. The cleaners hadn't been fooled for long. They had traced the trail of blood to the elevator, and now the metallic click of a weapon being readied sounded just outside Chloe's thin wooden door. Inside, the air turned to ice. Seojun tried to haul himself up, his muscles screaming, his face contorting into a mask of pure agony. He reached for the pistol in his lap, but his fingers were numb, the heavy steel slipping from his grasp and thudding onto the rug. He looked at Chloe, his eyes wide with a frantic, silent command, "Run." But Chloe didn't run. Something had snapped deep within her, a primal instinct overriding the logic of the college student who worried about midterms and library fines. She looked at the bed where Yuna and Yumi lay, vulnerable, breathing softly, entirely unaware that death was standing on the other side of a deadbolt. "Get behind the counter," Chloe whispered, her voice no longer trembling. It was flat, hard, and colder than the rain outside. She moved with a terrifying clarity. She didn't reach for the gun, she wouldn't know how to use it, but she grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from her stovetop and positioned herself in front of the bed. She was a girl in a damp t-shirt, standing in a room lit by pink fairy lights, but as she squared her shoulders, she felt like a wall of granite. The door didn't just open, it exploded inward under a tactical kick. Two men in black tactical gear blurred into the room, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the space. The lead assassin's eyes locked onto Seojun, who was slumped against the sofa, but before he could level his barrel, Chloe lunged from the shadows of the kitchenette. She swung the skillet with every ounce of terror and love in her body. The heavy metal connected with the side of the first man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled, his weapon skittering across the floor. The second man pivoted, but the narrowness of the studio worked against him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sight of a petite girl screaming a raw, guttural battle cry to protect two newborns. That second was all Seojun needed. Driven by a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged from the floor, his hand finding the pistol he'd dropped. Two muffled shots rang out. The second assassin fell, a single red bloom appearing on his chest. Silence returned to the apartment, heavier and darker than before. Chloe stood over the first man, her chest heaving, her knuckles white around the handle of the pan. She looked at the bodies, then at the twins, who had started to fuss at the noise. She wasn't just a student anymore. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She looked at Seojun, and for the first time the tiger saw a reflection of his own lethal soul in the eyes of the girl who had saved him. The heavy silence that followed the gunshots was thick with the scent of cordite and copper. Chloe stood frozen, her fingers still locked around the handle of the skillet, her eyes fixed on the motionless men on her floor. The world felt tilted, the pink glow of her fairy lights reflecting off the blood pooling on her thrift store rug. She didn't feel like a student anymore. She felt like something older, something forged in a fire she hadn't known existed until an hour ago. A low, pained grunt from the sofa snapped her back to reality. Seojun was attempting to stand, his face a ghostly mask of sweat and exertion. He used the arm of the couch for leverage, his muscles trembling violently as he forced his body to obey. The tiger was battered. His expensive suit a ruin of silk and gore, but the lethal authority in his eyes had returned with a vengeance. He managed to find his footing, swaying slightly before his gaze settled on Chloe. He didn't look at her with the cold calculation of a mafia boss or the suspicion of a hunted man. Instead, he looked at her with a profound, almost painful reverence. He had watched her stand between his children and a submachine gun with nothing but a kitchen tool and raw courage. He had spent his life surrounded by loyal soldiers who would sell him for a promotion, but this girl, this stranger from a world of textbooks and quiet dreams, had offered him the only thing that was truly priceless, a selfless shield. "It is over," Seojun rasped, his voice regaining its deep, gravelly resonance. He reached out, his blood-stained hand gently prying the iron skillet from her white-knuckled grip. "You have done enough, Chloe Davis." He turned toward the bed where Yuna and Yumi had finally fallen back into a deep, exhausted sleep. He realized then that while he could build them a fortress of steel and guard it with 1,000 guns, he could never give them the one thing Chloe had provided in a single night. He was the shadow, the man who dealt in the darkness to keep the world away, but Chloe was the light they actually needed. She was the proof that the world wasn't just made of predators and prey. As the distant sirens of his own loyal reinforcements finally began to wail through the rainy streets, Seojun looked back at the small, cramped apartment. He knew that when he walked out that door to reclaim his throne and punish those who had betrayed him, he would be a different man. He leaned in, his forehead briefly touching Chloe's in a gesture of silent, eternal debt. "They will never forget your face," he whispered, his voice a vow that echoed in the tiny room. "And neither will I." The tiger had risen, but as he stepped into the hallway to face his destiny, he left behind a piece of his heart in the hands of the girl who had taught a monster how to hope. 5 years had passed, but the gold-embossed card still sat in the top drawer of Chloe's desk, tucked safely beneath her nursing degree. She didn't need to look at it to know it was there. She felt its weight every time a sleek black car drifted slowly past her new apartment, or whenever a bouquet of lilies appeared on her doorstep on the anniversary of that rainy night. Life had returned to a version of normal, yet the world felt different, sharper, safer, and quietly watched. In a high-walled villa on the outskirts of Seoul, the tiger sat in a sun-drenched garden, far from the shadows of the alleyways. Seojun Kim watched as 2 small figures raced across the grass, their laughter ringing out like bells. Yuna and Yumi were no longer the fragile bundles wrapped in blood-stained fleece. They were vibrant, fierce, and full of a light that he had once thought was impossible in his lineage. Yuna stopped suddenly, picking a dandelion and running back to her father. She pressed the weed into his hand, the same hand that had once held a cold pistol in a dark studio apartment. "Daddy, is the lady coming today?" she asked, her dark eyes wide with anticipation. Seojun looked down at the simple flower, a small smile softening the permanent tension in his jaw. "The lady who taught us how to be brave?" he asked softly. Yuna nodded eagerly. Every month, a student visited them. She didn't come with guards or guns. She came with books, toys, and a laugh that made the giant house feel like a home. Chloe Davis had become the thread that tied their family to the world of the living. She was the one who reminded Seojun that he wasn't just a boss, but a man who owed his soul to the kindness of a stranger. "Yes," Seojun whispered, looking toward the heavy iron gates as they began to swing open. "She's here." As Chloe stepped out of a car, no longer the panicked girl in a damp hoodie, but a woman with steady hands and a heart of gold, the twins shrieked with joy and sprinted toward her. Seojun stood up, the wind catching his black overcoat. He stayed in the shadows of the porch, content to let them play in the sun. He was still the shadow, and the world was still dangerous, but as he watched Chloe gather his daughters into her arms, he knew the darkness would never win. The light she had brought into his apartment 5 years ago hadn't just saved his life, it had redefined it.